So we've taken a look at the Campages products.js file. There is a lot more to Campages. There's a lot of functionality in there, and I think the end product works fairly well. And as part of the deliverable, I did put together a document with a definition of all the functions and how they should be used, and an example of the inputs and outputs. And that documentation is really handy for people editing that functionality in the future. And so if anybody is interested in looking into Campages more, I'd be happy to walk through it with you. For now, though, we'll start going back through this document. So we've taken a look at cookies. I think we'll come back to cookies again in the future when we're using jQuery, and we can look at how jQuery adds, removes, and deletes cookies, and makes that all very simple for us. But for now, we'll look at timing. Timing is kind of a fun concept to look at. It gives us the ability to build fun and interactive functionality, and it can be particularly helpful when dealing with either complex animations or with games. So complex animations in that if we need to use timing, or if we have things that are supposed to come in at certain points, or that sort of thing, we'll need to rely on timing to make sure that those are all coming in at the right time. And games use it in a number of different ways. And so I've written a Tetris game, and we'll look at some of the code inside of there in a little bit. So there's 4 main methods for timing. There's really just 2 ways you can use a timeout or an interval, and then a timeout has a set and a clear method, and intervals have a set and clear function. So if we look at set timeout, set timeout can be called at any point, and nothing will execute until this pause has been added. And set timeout has 2 arguments. So the first is the function that you want to call, and the second argument is the amount of time that you want to time out before you call the function. So basically, at any point in our code, we can call set timeout, and after set timeout, I can say that I want to, I believe it needs to be in quotes. I could be wrong, but alert W3C would tell us. But we could do any functionality in here, so we could alert test, and we could do that after 1,000. That shouldn't be a string. We'll do that after 1,000 milliseconds. So whenever this gets called, it'll stop executing any JavaScript for 1 second, so 1,000 milliseconds, and after that it will alert test. We can also do this, like I mentioned, with functions. So set timeout, we can go jump, I don't know, and we'll do that in 1,000 seconds. And after, or not 1,000 seconds, 1,000 milliseconds. So after 1,000 milliseconds or 1 second, it'll call the jump function. So that's one way of using it. We can remove that timeout. So let's say we had a really long pause, let's say 100 seconds or 100,000 milliseconds. If we call clear timeout, it will remove the pause. It does not execute the function again, but it will remove it. And so clear timeout only has 1 argument. So when we call set timeout, we can call it with a variable name. So we can go var pause is equal to set timeout, and then if we call clear timeout on pause, then it'll cancel that. Set interval, on the other hand, gets called once, and it will execute the function on a set interval, and it does not need to be called every single time. So like set timeout, set interval has two functions, or sorry, two arguments. It has a function or variable name and the amount of time in milliseconds. And so, like I said, it will keep calling that function over and over and over again until the interval has been removed. And so, an example of this would be, we'll go, I don't know, int or var int for interval, I guess, is equal to set interval. And the function name I just looked does need to be in quotes, so we'll add it in quotes, and we'll go, I don't know, timer. We'll call our function name timer, and then comma, and we'll set how often that should be executed. And so in this case, again, our function timer will be called every 1 second, and it'll be called again and again and again until we call clear interval. And again, we'll call clear interval. Only has one argument, so we can just call clear interval, and we pass in the variable name for the set interval that we created. So when I call this, that will stop it from being, will stop timer, the timer function that we added, from being executed every second, and it will not be executed anymore. There is a fairly substantial difference between these two. They're very similar, but basically interval will be executed every x milliseconds, and timeout will execute every x seconds plus the amount of time that it takes to execute a function. So quite often you'll see set timeout will be called recursively. So inside of this jump function, we'll actually set another function, or another call to set timeout. And so that will be called recursively over and over and over again, which is very similar to set interval, but it only executes after the jump function has finished running. So while we can count on interval to run every 1,000 second or every 1,000 milliseconds, we can only count on timeout to run once it's been called. So that distinction is somewhat small, but it's important. It's especially important if, for example, we were working with a clock and we need a clock to tick every second. We could write a function. We could call our function tick. So if we, let's just do that. So we go function tick, not ticket, tick, and inside our function we do something, and then at the end we're going to call set timeout, and with this we're going to call tick, and we're going to do that every 1,000 seconds. So this is basically, we have a recursive function that tick does some functionality here, and then with a timeout it calls itself. And so basically that would look like every second it's going to call itself, except for it's going to call itself every second after it has executed this. So however long whatever we're doing here takes, this set timeout won't get called until after this is done. And so we could see if this only took 5 milliseconds to run or whatever, that means that every second our clock would get 5 milliseconds out of sync. Whereas with set interval happens outside of our function. And so if we go set interval, and we still want to call tick, let's say, and we say every 1,000 seconds. Every 1,000, I keep saying 1,000 seconds, but it is milliseconds. Every 1,000 milliseconds, tick will get called. And so no matter how long tick takes to run, it will get called every 1,000 milliseconds. And so this will not run into issues, and our clock will stay in sync. So that's a big difference between set interval and set timeout. Set timeout needs to happen, it happens just once, whereas set interval can have a function be called repeatedly. So if we open up the code example, this is a little HTML5 JavaScript Tetris game that I built. It was kind of fun. It has a lot of bugs. I never finished it because it was more just me wanting to prove that I could create this, and I was somewhat successful in that. So once I did that, I really kind of lost interest. So we can play this game, and I'm just gonna clear a line, and we can see that it disappears. But if we take a look at the code here, we can see that the actual HTML that we need is fairly minimal. Basically, all we're really doing is setting up a canvas and our image. And our image, just to show you quickly, is just a sprite. It has basically our whole board, and then it has our different types of blocks. And so that's just a sprite. We then have 3 JavaScript files that we're using. The first is just jQuery. The second is data.js, and so I've set up an object here that defines each of our blocks. And so we have, it looks like, 8 different blocks. And for each, I've created a shape property, which is an array. And we can see that this will be the top line, this will be the bottom. And so we can just say here that this is actually going to be a triangle. So we have a rectangle on its side. The first top left block is nothing. The top middle is there, and top right is not. Whereas on the bottom row, each of our blocks are filled in. Start call, this is just, I'll show that later, but it just shows how far left the block should start dropping. And then we have our background X and background Y. So this just refers to, in the sprite, what block background image it should use. And that's just a start X and start Y for that. And each of our shapes here have, or each of our blocks has a shape. So this would be a square, and it has its own start call. And this is where we reference the block sprite. And then we have our board here, and this really could be a little bit nicer, but it helped me just to visualize what the board looked like by having a whole bunch of zeros, and I could actually visualize this being filled up with ones and zeros. Our second file, and this is kind of the meat, is function.js. And right away we can see that this is a little bit cleaner. So I wrote this after cam pages, and it's a little bit easier to read. But we have our initial function, so this is function init. And this sets up some global variables. And so I did mention in the last video that sometimes global variables are good. And this is a case where we can use global variables. Like title underscore width, so we don't, or sorry, tile underscore width, we don't want the width or height of our tiles to change. But if we did want to make our board bigger, it's nice to be able to set this once inside our code, because we will be using this variable a lot when we're doing our math. Game underscore X and game underscore Y just points to where on the sprite the actual game board lives, so that when we draw the blocks, we can draw them in the right place. And game width and game height just tells us how tall and how wide our game area is. Speed is equal to 500, so this is 500 milliseconds, and we'll see the timer in a second. And the speed is how often our timer is running. The reason that we're using a variable for this is so that each level we can increase our speed. And multiplier, we're not actually using this right now, but this is so that every level we can increase our speed by, and this would be increasing it by 5%. And level points is how much completing a level is worth. I will start another video and we will continue there.